I never imagined that the strangest day of my life would begin with white roses blowing in the wind on property that my father and grandfather built with their own hands. Most people think a wedding is something beautiful that brings families together, but the day a woman decided to throw her daughter's expensive lakeside ceremony on my private dock without asking, she accidentally declared a war she didn't even know she had started. Looking back now, I still laugh at parts of it. But at 3:45 that Saturday afternoon, there wasn't a single thing funny about what I was seeing. My name is Ethan Calloway. I'm 51 years old, and for nearly 3 decades, I've made my living repairing boats and guiding fishing trips around Cedar Hollow Lake in northern Wisconsin. It isn't a glamorous life, but it has always been an honest one. My family bought the narrow strip of shoreline back in the late 70s when nobody wanted it because the road was rough and the winters were brutal. My grandfather built the original dock himself, hammer by hammer, while my father expanded it years later after saving money from working double shifts at the paper mill. When they both passed away, the dock became more than wood and bolts to me. It became the last place where I could still hear their voices if I stood quietly enough. A few years ago, I spent almost $40,000 rebuilding it after a storm, replacing rotten beams, installing new power lines, reinforcing the platform because I wanted my own kids to inherit something worth keeping. That's why what happened next felt less like a misunderstanding and more like someone walking into my living room and deciding to host Thanksgiving dinner without inviting me. I had been at the marina since sunrise fixing an engine for a customer who swore he had only hit one floating log, although judging by the damage, I suspected he had tried to race a beaver dam. Around 3:30, I packed my tools into my truck and drove home, already thinking about grilling burgers and sitting by the water with a cold drink. As I turned onto the gravel lane leading to my property, traffic slowed to a crawl. Cars were parked on both sides, some halfway in the ditch, others blocking driveways. I muttered to myself that somebody must be having a family reunion nearby. Then I noticed women in matching pale blue dresses walking toward the lake carrying bouquets. Another 100 feet, and I saw men wearing black suits, adjusting ties. My stomach tightened. None of these people belonged on my land. I parked and walked faster, expecting maybe a photographer had wandered over from the neighboring subdivision for a few pictures. Instead, I reached the shoreline and stopped dead. My dock had disappeared beneath an entire wedding venue. White folding chairs stretched in neat rows. A flower arch stood at the end overlooking the lake. Expensive speakers lined both sides. Strings of lights hung from poles someone had installed into my decking, and long catering tables were already covered with silver trays waiting for dinner. A red carpet ran from my lawn to the water as though royalty was about to arrive. I counted dozens of guests chatting, laughing, and taking pictures while a young woman in a designer wedding gown stood smiling beside a nervous groom. Nobody looked confused. Nobody looked guilty. They looked comfortable, like they believed they had every right to be there. Then I recognized a familiar voice barking orders at a florist. It belonged to Lorraine Hastings, president of the Harbor Ridge Community Association, a woman whose favorite hobby seemed to be reminding everyone else how important she thought she was. Over the years, we'd crossed paths several times whenever her board wanted easier lake access or tried to tell neighboring property owners what colors they should paint their sheds. She had that polished smile people wear right before asking for something they know isn't theirs. The moment she spotted me, she waved casually as if I were another vendor arriving late. "Perfect timing," she called. "Can you move your truck? The bridal entrance will be coming through here." I stared at her for a second, honestly waiting for the punchline. "Lorraine," I said quietly, "this is my dock." She blinked once before laughing. "Oh, don't be difficult today. Everyone knows this has always been used by the neighborhood." I shook my head. "No, everyone knows people have walked onto it, because I never made a scene. That's different from giving permission for 80 guests and a full wedding." She crossed her arms and lowered her voice. "We've invested a fortune into this ceremony. The invitations are out. The musicians are paid. You're not going to ruin my daughter's day over a technicality." It wasn't the money she mentioned that bothered me. It was the word technicality. The place my grandfather built with splintered hands, the place my father repaired every spring, had been reduced to a technicality by someone who simply assumed that confidence could replace permission. I looked around again and realized the ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than 15 minutes. Half the guests were already seated. The DJ was testing microphones. The photographer was directing the bride toward the end of my dock where the sunset would hit the water just right. Lorraine smiled one more time and said, "Just stay out of sight for an hour and everyone will be happy." At that exact moment, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and instead of arguing another second, I dialed 911. The dispatcher answered with the calm voice you only hear from someone who has already dealt with every kind of chaos imaginable, and she asked me to explain what was happening. I looked at the flower arch sitting on my dock, at the guests laughing with champagne glasses in their hands, and I almost felt ridiculous saying the words out loud. "Ma'am, there's a wedding taking place on my private property and nobody asked permission." There was a short pause before she asked if there was any violence. "Not yet," I replied, "and I'd like to keep it that way." She told me to stay where I was and that a deputy was nearby. I slipped my phone back in my pocket, and Lorraine walked over with the expression of someone who believed she had already won. "Who were you calling?" she asked. "The sheriff," I answered. She rolled her eyes and actually laughed. "Ethan, don't embarrass yourself. This is a community event. Nobody is going to stop a bride from getting married." I looked her straight in the eye and said, "No, Lorraine, this isn't a community event. It's trespassing with catering." She frowned for a second, then turned away and started telling a florist to move another arrangement. It amazed me how completely she dismissed the possibility that the law might apply to her. Standing there, I remembered every little argument we'd had over the years. The association had complained about my fishing nets drying in my yard because they weren't attractive enough for passing visitors. They once suggested I trim a line of old cedar trees because they blocked the lake view from several expensive homes. Another time, they asked if they could temporarily store kayaks beside my dock for a weekend, and somehow that temporary arrangement lasted nearly 3 months until I removed them myself. Every conversation followed the same pattern. Lorraine would ask politely, then assume permission if she didn't hear the answer she wanted. I should have stopped it years ago, but I had always chosen peace over confrontation because life on the lake is easier when neighbors can wave at each other instead of hiring lawyers. Unfortunately, some people mistake kindness for weakness. About 5 minutes later, a sheriff's SUV rolled into the driveway. The conversations around the wedding slowed as people noticed the flashing lights reflecting off the parked cars. Deputy Marcus Hale stepped out, greeted me, and calmly asked to see documentation proving ownership. I walked into my workshop and returned with a property file I always kept in a waterproof cabinet. Inside were surveys, permits, tax records, photographs from construction, and the deed itself. He spent several minutes reviewing everything while Lorraine marched over with determined footsteps. "Officer," she interrupted, "this is just a misunderstanding. The previous owner always let neighborhood events happen here." Deputy Hale looked at her and asked, "Do you have anything in writing?" Lorraine hesitated just long enough to answer the question without saying a word. "Well, everyone knows it." The deputy closed the folder and handed it back to me. "Ma'am," he said in a steady voice, "property rights are not determined by what everyone knows. They are determined by legal ownership." The smile disappeared from her face. Around us, guests had stopped talking and were watching the conversation unfold. The bride, whose name I later learned was Madison, looked confused as she walked over holding the edge of her dress above the wooden planks. She looked no older than 26 and honestly seemed unaware of what was happening. "Mom," she whispered, "what's going on?" Lorraine forced another smile. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just a small paperwork issue." Deputy Hale took a step toward the center of the dock and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need your attention. This structure is privately owned. The owner has not granted permission for this event. You are required to leave the property." The silence that followed felt heavier than thunder. A man near the front actually laughed because he thought it was some kind of joke. Another guest looked around waiting for hidden cameras. The DJ slowly lowered his headphones and asked, "So, should I stop the music?" Nobody answered him. Then Lorraine exploded. This is absurd. We have 80 guests here. The ceremony starts in minutes. You can't expect us to move now." Deputy Hale didn't raise his voice. "Ma'am, I'm not asking whether it's convenient. I'm informing you that remaining here after being instructed to leave could result in trespassing violations." She turned toward me, her face bright red. "Are you seriously doing this to my daughter?" The question hung in the air, and for a second, even I wondered whether I should simply walk away and let it happen. I looked at Madison. She seemed embarrassed, frightened, almost trapped between loyalty to her mother and the reality unfolding around her. Then I looked at the dock itself. New scratches covered the boards where heavy equipment had been dragged across them. Extension cords were taped over freshly sealed wood. Someone had drilled brackets into support posts to hold decorations. My grandfather used to tell me that if you allow people to disrespect something once, they will assume they own it forever. I took a slow breath and answered, "No, Lorraine. You did this to your daughter when you planned her wedding on land that wasn't yours." She shook her head and whispered, "You're unbelievable." "Maybe," I replied, "but I'm still the owner." The deputy gave everyone several minutes to gather their belongings. Some guests quietly picked up purses and jackets, but many remained seated because Lorraine kept insisting everything would be resolved. The photographer nervously checked his watch every few seconds. The officiant looked as though he wished he could disappear into the lake. Meanwhile, the DJ approached me privately and said, "Sir, I don't want any trouble. They hired me. Just tell me what you need me to do." I told him none of this was personal and suggested he pack his equipment before it became complicated. He nodded and started disconnecting cables. But Lorraine immediately shouted across the dock, "Leave it alone. We're continuing." That's when I realized she still believed I would eventually give in simply because too many people were watching. At exactly 4 o'clock, the scheduled start time printed on every invitation, she lifted her hands and signaled for the music to begin. The DJ hesitated, looking from her to me and then to the deputy. Before anyone could decide what to do, I walked to the weatherproof electrical panel that supplied the dock. I placed my hand on a main switch and looked back one final time. The bride stood frozen. The groom stared at the water. Lorraine glared at me with absolute certainty that I wouldn't dare. Then I flipped the switch. Instantly, the string lights went dark. The speakers fell silent. The microphones died, and the decorative fountain they had installed stopped flowing. The only sound left was the wind moving across the lake and a child somewhere in the crowd asking his father why everything had suddenly turned off. People began murmuring. Several guests stood up at once. Lorraine screamed my name so loudly that birds lifted from nearby trees. "Turn it back on," she yelled. I calmly answered, "It's easier to turn off electricity than it is to turn private property into public property." The deputy stepped between us before she could march over. Then another thought crossed my mind. Earlier that week, I had planned routine maintenance on the outer section of the dock because a connector plate needed replacing. My tools were already in the workshop. Without saying another word, I grabbed my wrench and walked toward the end of the structure where the removable extension connected to the main platform. I knelt, loosened several bolts, and began disconnecting the section exactly as scheduled. The metal clanged against the wood. A few guests noticed what I was doing and immediately backed away. Someone shouted that the dock might be unsafe. Panic spreads faster than facts, especially when people are dressed for a wedding instead of construction work. Within moments, the orderly rows of chairs dissolved into confused movement as families hurried towards shore, carrying flowers, handbags, and folding seats. Deputy Hale raised his voice again, directing everyone to leave calmly. But by then the crowd had already decided that staying was not worth the risk. In less than 10 minutes, the place that had looked like a luxury ceremony became a battlefield of abandoned decorations, overturned ribbons, and half-packed catering trays, while Lorraine stood in the middle of it all staring at me, with a look that promised the story was far from over. Lorraine pointed a finger at me as the last guest walked toward the parking area and shouted that I would regret humiliating her family. But by then the anger in her voice sounded different from the confidence she had worn all afternoon. Confidence comes from believing you control the situation. This was something else. This was panic. The bride sat inside a black SUV with tears running down her face while the groom stared out the window without saying a word. And for a brief moment, I honestly felt sorry for them because whatever mistakes had been made that day, they had inherited a disaster that wasn't entirely of their own making. Deputy Hale stayed long enough to make an incident report, took photographs of the decorations attached to my dock, and advised me to document everything before cleaning up. As the vehicles disappeared one by one, the lake became quiet again, almost as if it had been holding its breath through the entire confrontation. I stood there looking at flower petals scattered across the boards my grandfather once built, and I couldn't stop thinking about something he used to tell me when I was a kid. People don't usually steal a farm all at once, Ethan. They borrow a fence, then a corner, then a pathway, and eventually they act surprised when you remind them it was yours. The next morning I was drinking coffee when an envelope arrived by certified mail. It came from an attorney representing Lorraine. According to the letter, there had supposedly been a verbal understanding with a former owner allowing neighborhood events to take place on the dock. The problem was simple. The former owner they referenced had sold the property years before he passed away, and every document transferring ownership had been recorded properly. There was no written easement, no contract, no permission, nothing but assumptions wrapped in expensive legal language. My own attorney laughed after reading it and said, "Sometimes people mistake confidence for evidence." We prepared a response, and that should have been the end of the story, except something unexpected happened while reviewing old photographs and maintenance logs. I began noticing unfamiliar boats tied to my dock over the years, kayaks leaning against the railings, paddleboards stacked beside my storage shed. At first, I thought they belonged to customers, but then I started comparing dates with security camera backups I had installed after storm damage a few seasons earlier. The footage told an entirely different story. Residents from Harbor Ridge had been using my dock regularly for years whenever they wanted easier lake access. Families unloaded coolers, teenagers launched kayaks, visitors parked bicycles beside my shed, and nobody ever asked permission. Because I spent many mornings on the water and many afternoons working in town, they had simply developed a habit. A habit eventually becomes an expectation, and an expectation can become entitlement if nobody challenges it. I decided that would end immediately. The following weekend, a contractor installed a heavy steel gate at the entrance to the walkway leading to the dock. I added security cameras, new lighting, and a simple sign that read private property, no trespassing, unauthorized access will be prosecuted. The reaction from Harbor Ridge was almost immediate. Within hours, my phone filled with messages from people asking why they suddenly couldn't reach the lake from what they call the neighborhood dock. I answered every call the same way. It has never been the neighborhood dock. It has always been mine. A week later, the association requested a meeting. Their attorney, several board members, and Lorraine all sat across from me at a long conference table inside the town hall. Nobody smiled this time. They explained that many homeowners had purchased property believing convenient lake access existed through my dock, because that had been the practice for years. I replied that practice and permission are two different things. Then I handed over an invoice listing cleanup costs, repairs to damaged boards, replacement hardware, legal expenses, and lost business from the interrupted weekend. The total was substantial enough that the room became silent. Lorraine pushed the paper back toward me and said, "You're trying to profit from this." I calmly answered, "No, I'm asking you to pay for what your decisions cost." One older board member who had remained quiet finally spoke. He looked at Lorraine instead of me and asked a simple question. "Did you ever ask him?" She hesitated. "No." "Did you ever have permission?" Again she answered no. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a second. Sometimes the smallest admissions carry the greatest weight. Negotiations continued for several hours before another issue emerged. Without my dock, Harbor Ridge had no practical access point for dozens of residents who stored kayaks and small boats. The nearest public launch required a long drive and often filled before sunrise during the summer. Their convenience had quietly depended on my generosity all these years. I made an offer. If the association wanted legal access in the future, it would have to sign a formal agreement, contribute to maintenance costs, and accept strict conditions regarding insurance, scheduling, and liability. If payments stopped or the rules were ignored, the agreement would end immediately. For the first time since I had known her, Lorraine had no speech prepared. She simply stared at the table while other board members whispered among themselves. 2 weeks later, I heard that the residents held a special meeting and voted to replace her as president. Whether they blamed her for the failed wedding, the legal bills, or the embarrassment suffered by the community, I honestly don't know. I wasn't there. I was back where I prefer to be, standing on my dock just before sunset with a fishing rod in my hand and the water reflecting orange across the lake. Sometimes people ask whether I regret shutting off the power and stopping that ceremony. My answer usually surprises them. I regret that an innocent bride spent part of her wedding day crying over a decision she probably didn't make. I regret that pride kept someone from knocking on my door and asking a simple question. But I do not regret defending what generations of my family worked to build, because respect cannot exist if boundaries mean nothing. Even today, visitors notice the sign at the entrance and smile when they read it. But every now and then someone says I should have just let the wedding happen. Maybe they're right. Maybe kindness should have come before principle. Or maybe allowing people to take what isn't theirs only teaches them to come back for more. I'll let you decide. If you were standing in my boots that afternoon and found 80 strangers celebrating on your private property without permission, would you have walked away, or would you have done exactly what I did? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this never really end when the people involved go home. They end when everyone finally agrees on where fairness begins and where entitlement has to stop.